Her husband left her by text and took everything, laughing at her misfortune. He never saw it coming. It was an ordinary morning when the phone buzzed on the nightstand. The woman reached out sleepily, expecting a reminder or a casual message. But what she saw made her blood run cold. A single text from her husband read, "I'm leaving you. I took everything. Don't bother calling. Good luck surviving." Her fingers trembled as she reread the words, hoping she had misunderstood. But there it was, plain and simple, a message that shattered her world. Her breath hitched as realization settled in. He was gone. After 10 years of marriage, no warning, no conversation, just a few words on a screen. Frantic, she threw off the covers and rushed to check their bank account. Her heart pounded as the screen loaded, and then, reality struck her with full force. The balance read, $0. He had drained every last penny from their joint savings. Everything they had built together, every sacrifice she had made for their future, it was all gone. Panic clawed at her chest as she scrolled through the transaction history. In the dead of night, he had methodically emptied account after account, moving the money somewhere she had no access to. Her hands clenched into fists. How could he do this? How could he be so heartless? As the shock wore off, rage took its place. He hadn't just left, he had destroyed her. He knew she had given up her job to support his career. He knew she had trusted him with everything. And he had taken advantage of that trust in the cruelest way possible. She fought back the tears that threatened to spill. Crying wouldn't change anything. She had to think, had to act. But the weight of betrayal crushed her, making it hard to even stand. A sharp knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. When she opened it, she was met with another cruel surprise. A man in a suit stood there, holding a clipboard. "Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of the bank. Your mortgage payment has bounced, and foreclosure proceedings will begin soon." Her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Not only had her husband left her with nothing, but he had also ensured that she would lose the roof over her head. She closed the door in a daze. The walls of their once warm home now felt cold, suffocating. Every memory, every picture on the wall mocked her. He had turned their love into a joke. And worst of all, he had enjoyed it. The text still burned in her mind, "Good luck surviving." He had left her to fall, fully expecting her to crumble. But as she wiped away a stray tear, something inside her hardened. He thought she was weak. He thought she would beg. He thought wrong. The hours passed in a blur of disbelief and anger. She tried calling him, but of course, the number was disconnected. Every social media profile had been wiped clean, every trace of him erased. It was as if he had never existed. But she knew better. He had done this intentionally, methodically. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it had been planned for months. And she had never seen it coming. Desperate, she called his best friend, hoping for some answers. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Look. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but he's in another city now. With someone else. A much younger woman." The words felt like a slap to the face. "He's been seeing her for a while. I thought you knew." Her grip tightened around the phone. Of course, she hadn't known. He had made a fool of her, and now, he was laughing, probably sipping champagne with his new conquest, thinking she was utterly broken. She wasn't just heartbroken, she was humiliated. The people around them had known. They had watched her live in ignorance, pitted her behind her back. The weight of that realization was unbearable. But no matter how much it hurt, she wouldn't let it destroy her. If he thought she would wallow in self-pity, he was mistaken. She would rise. And when the time was right, she would make sure he regretted ever underestimating her. The following weeks were a test of endurance. With no money, no income, and bills piling up, she had no choice but to take the first job she could find, a position at a small cafe, wiping tables and taking orders. She had once managed projects worth millions, and now she was being snapped at by impatient customers who barely glanced her way. The humiliation stung, but she bit her tongue and endured. Each shift was grueling, but it kept her moving. If she stopped, the thoughts would creep back in, the memories of a comfortable life, the laughter she had once shared with a man who turned out to be a stranger. At night, she slept on a mattress on the floor of a cramped apartment she could barely afford. The city lights outside her window flickered like a distant dream, reminding her of everything she had lost. But as painful as it was, she was learning something important. She wasn't as weak as he thought. Every day she survived was proof that she was stronger than the destruction he had left behind. And deep inside, a quiet fire was beginning to burn. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The discovery of her forgotten investment reignited something inside her, a sense of control, a glimmer of hope. It was a modest sum, but it represented possibility. For weeks, she had lived under the weight of loss, believing she had nothing left. But now, she realized that wasn't entirely true. She spent every spare moment researching, learning about finance, business strategies, and investments. What little money she had, she treated with precision, cutting out every unnecessary expense and setting strict goals for herself. Her days were still grueling. She worked double shifts at the cafe, her feet aching by the time she dragged herself home. But now, there was a purpose behind her suffering. Every tip she collected, every dollar she saved, brought her one step closer to rebuilding. She refused to be reckless. Her ex-husband had robbed her blind, but she would be smarter. She would take what little she had and turn it into something greater. And when she finally rose from the ashes, he wouldn't see it coming. With careful planning, she made her first small investment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She had spent weeks studying market trends, analyzing risks, and learning from financial experts online. She was no longer the woman who blindly trusted someone else with her future. She was taking control. Every spare moment was dedicated to growth, whether through late-night reading or online courses she found for free. Knowledge became her weapon, and patience became her greatest ally. Her co-workers mocked her efforts. They saw a waitress scrimping and saving, as if it would ever make a difference. Still dreaming of being rich again, one of them sneered. She ignored them. Their words held no power over her. They only saw her present struggle, but she saw the long game. And deep inside, she knew something they didn't. She was no longer a victim. She was rebuilding, one calculated step at a time. And soon, she would be unstoppable. The weeks turned into months, and progress was slow. Some investments paid off, others didn't. There were moments of doubt, times when she questioned whether she was just fooling herself. The temptation to give up was always there, whispering that she was wasting her time. But she silenced it. Every setback was a lesson. Every failure taught her something new. She refused to let fear dictate her future the way it had dictated her past. One evening, after another exhausting shift, she logged into her account and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Her investment had doubled. It wasn't millions, not even close, but it was proof that she was on the right path. The realization filled her with a quiet satisfaction. She had spent years believing she needed someone else to provide for her, to build a secure future. But now, she understood the truth: she was more than capable on her own. And this was just the beginning. One afternoon, as she took a rare break at the cafe, a well-dressed man approached her table. At first, she assumed he was a customer, but then he spoke her name. "I've been looking for you," he said, a hint of recognition in his eyes. Confused, she studied his face. He was vaguely familiar, though she couldn't immediately place him. Then, it clicked: he was an old colleague from the corporate world, someone she had worked with before her marriage. "I heard about what happened," he said, lowering his voice. "And I also heard you've been making some smart moves lately." Her breath caught. She had been careful, keeping her progress quiet. "There's an opportunity," he continued. "It's small, but I think you'd be perfect for it." Her mind raced. She hadn't dared to hope for a way back into the world she had lost. But now, a door was opening. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something unfamiliar: excitement. The opportunity wasn't glamorous, it was a temporary consulting job for a struggling startup. But she didn't care. It was a foot in the door, a chance to prove herself again. She juggled the new role with her shifts at the cafe, pushing herself harder than ever. Sleep became a luxury, exhaustion a constant companion. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. She had been left with nothing, stripped of dignity and security. Now, she was clawing her way back, on her own terms. Her first project was a success. The startup's numbers improved, and word of her skill spread. Soon, she was offered another contract, then another. She was still far from the wealth she had once known, but something felt different this time. This wasn't money handed to her by a husband who could take it away. This was hers, earned through her own intelligence and resilience. She was building something permanent, something no one could ever steal. As her reputation grew, so did her earnings. The money she had once fought to save now worked for her, growing steadily through careful investments. She finally left the cafe job, walking out with her head held high, ignoring the whispers of disbelief from her former coworkers. They had laughed at her struggle, dismissed her as just another woman abandoned and ruined. But they had no idea who they had been mocking. Then, the moment she had been waiting for arrived, an opportunity that would change everything. A well-known firm reached out, offering her a position that would put her back in the game completely. The salary was more than she had ever hoped for, the kind of financial security she had thought was lost forever. As she signed the contract, she realized something: she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was winning. And soon, the man who had left her for dead would find out just how wrong he had been. The first sign that her ex-husband had noticed her resurgence came in the form of a message, an unexpected, smugly familiar number flashing on her phone screen. At first, she hesitated, debating whether to ignore it entirely. But curiosity won. She opened the message, expecting an attempt at an apology or perhaps a taunt. Instead, it was a simple question: "How have you been?" The audacity of it made her laugh, a hollow, bitter sound. He had left her in financial ruin, mocking her as he ran off with another woman. And now, when she was finally regaining control of her life, he had the nerve to act as if they were old friends catching up. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. He had heard about her success, that much was clear. Perhaps through mutual connections, perhaps from his own paranoia, but the realization must have hit him hard. The woman he had expected to crumble had instead rebuilt herself into something greater. She could almost picture him now, sitting comfortably in his new life, growing uneasy as he realized she was no longer a footnote in his story. But he was mistaken. This wasn't just about proving him wrong. This was about proving to herself that she was far more powerful than she had ever imagined. Not long after the message, she ran into him in person. It was bound to happen eventually. They had shared a life for years, had mutual acquaintances, and despite his best efforts to erase her, their worlds had overlapped too much to stay separate forever. The encounter happened at an upscale business event she had been invited to, now a rising name in the corporate world once again. She had dressed with intention, exuding quiet confidence as she navigated the room, greeting people who now respected her in a way they never had before. Then, she saw him. He was across the room, deep in conversation, but when his eyes landed on her, his expression faltered. For a brief second, pure disbelief flickered across his face, quickly masked by forced indifference. But she saw it. He hadn't expected this. He had convinced himself she would forever be the broken woman he had abandoned. Yet here she was, standing in a place he never thought she'd reach again. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she turned away, a smirk tugging at her lips. He had already lost the moment he realized she no longer cared. Word traveled fast. It wasn't long before she learned that his supposedly perfect life wasn't as flawless as he had made it seem. The young woman he had left her for had expected a fairy tale, lavish trips, endless luxury, the life of a trophy girlfriend. But reality had caught up with them. His reckless spending had drained more than he anticipated, and while he had once believed himself untouchable, his financial situation was no longer as secure as he had assumed. Rumors surfaced. Business deals had fallen through. Investments had soured. The money he had stolen from their joint accounts had carried him for a while, but it wasn't infinite. And now, as her own fortune was rising, his was declining. It was poetic, really. He had left her with nothing, thinking she would never recover. But now, she was thriving, and he was barely keeping his head above water. She hadn't lifted a finger against him, hadn't sought revenge. The universe was doing it for her. And she was more than happy to watch. It took longer than she expected, but eventually, the inevitable happened. He reached out again. This time, it wasn't a casual message. It was an apology, carefully crafted to seem sincere. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I regret how things ended. I hope we can talk." She stared at the words for a long moment, emotions warring inside her. There had been a time when she would have given anything to hear those words, to believe them. But now? Now, they were empty. She didn't need his apology. It wouldn't change the past, wouldn't undo the suffering he had caused. And she certainly didn't owe him a response. Yet, a part of her wanted to see the regret in his eyes, to hear the desperation in his voice. Not because she wanted him back, never that, but because she wanted him to understand that the woman he had destroyed no longer existed. She had become something far greater, and he was nothing more than a reminder of who she used to be. Their meeting took place in a quiet cafe, one she had chosen deliberately, nothing fancy, nothing extravagant. Just neutral ground. When he arrived, he looked different. The arrogance that had once been a permanent fixture in his expression was dimmed, replaced by something more uncertain. "You look amazing," he said, as if realizing for the first time just how much she had changed. She simply nodded, waiting. He stumbled through his apology, carefully choosing his words, trying to paint himself as a man who had simply made a mistake. But she saw the truth. He wasn't here because he truly regretted what he had done. He was here because he saw what she had become, and he wanted a piece of it. And then, the moment came. He sighed, leaning forward. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he admitted. "Maybe we should give it another try." For a second, she almost laughed. He was serious. He truly believed she would take him back, that he could rewrite history and slip back into her life like nothing had happened. The sheer absurdity of it made her shake her head, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "You really have no idea, do you?" she said softly. And as he blinked in confusion, she realized that this moment right here, was her victory. He thought he was giving her an offer. He didn't understand that he was the one who had lost everything. After that meeting, his downfall accelerated. His finances unraveled further, his new relationship disintegrated, and the people who had once admired him began to distance themselves. The life he had built on deception and selfishness was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Meanwhile, she continued to rise, her success now undeniable. She never needed revenge. She never had to plot his destruction. His own choices had done that for him. And as she stood at the pinnacle of her own achievements, she felt nothing but gratitude for the lesson, for the struggle, for the chance to build a life that was truly her own. He had tried to destroy her. Instead, he had set her free. And as she turned away from his pathetic attempts to reconnect, she knew she would never look back. After that final meeting, she erased him from her mind completely. There was no point in lingering on the past, no need to waste another thought on a man who had shown her exactly who he was. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered, her future. The business world had fully embraced her return, and with each passing day, she cemented her place among those who had once overlooked her. She was no longer just a woman recovering from betrayal, she was a force to be reckoned with. Opportunities flooded in. Her strategic decisions brought success not just to herself but to those who trusted in her vision. Companies sought her expertise, and influential figures in the industry began to take notice. She had built something far greater than she ever imagined, not just wealth, but respect. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly untouchable. Her success was hers alone. No one could take it from her, least of all the man who had tried to bury her. Meanwhile, her ex-husband's life continued to unravel. His lavish spending had drained what little remained of the money he had stolen. The young woman he had left her for had long since abandoned him, moving on to someone with deeper pockets and fewer financial problems. He had made the fatal mistake of believing his charm alone would be enough to sustain him, but charm didn't pay the bills. As his resources dwindled, so did the patience of those around him. His former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man who had nothing to offer. Business connections evaporated, leaving him scrambling for any opportunity to restore his once glamorous life. But it was too late. He had burned too many bridges, taken too many shortcuts. He had played the game recklessly, assuming he would always come out on top. Now, he was watching everything slip through his fingers, powerless to stop it. One evening, as she reviewed reports in her office, an unexpected email appeared in her inbox. At first, she assumed it was another business proposal. But when she saw the sender's name, she froze. It was him. Her instinct was to delete it without opening it, but curiosity got the better of her. With a sigh, she clicked. The message was long, longer than anything he had ever written to her before. It was an apology, of course, but this time, there was something different. It wasn't just regret, it was desperation. He spoke of his failures, how his life had crumbled, how he wished he could undo what he had done. And at the end, a plea, "I have nothing left. I need help." She stared at the screen for a long moment, the weight of his words settling in. This was the man who had abandoned her without a second thought, who had laughed at her misfortune, who had stolen from her and left her for dead. And now, here he was, begging for mercy. The irony was almost poetic. She didn't feel satisfaction in his suffering. She didn't feel pity either. What she felt was complete and utter indifference. His fate was no longer her concern. With a few keystrokes, she typed a single response, "Good luck." The same words he had sent her on the day he left. Then, without hesitation, she deleted the email, blocking his address. She had no desire to see his name ever again. Whatever happened to him now was his own doing. She owed him nothing. And as she closed her laptop, she realized just how much she had changed. The woman he had left behind was gone. The one who remained was stronger, wiser, and completely untouchable. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, turning every hardship into a stepping stone. She had risen so high that his existence no longer mattered. He was nothing more than a distant memory, a mistake she had learned from. And she would never make the same mistake again. In the months that followed, she barely thought of him. Her life had become too full, too rich with new experiences and achievements to waste time dwelling on a past that no longer defined her. She traveled, expanded her business, and surrounded herself with people who truly valued her. Every moment was a reminder that she had won, not by seeking revenge, but by thriving in ways he could never have imagined. She occasionally heard whispers of his downfall, but they no longer evoked any emotion. He had once loomed so large in her life, his betrayal consuming her every thought. Now, he was insignificant, a man whose own greed had destroyed him. She had escaped the wreckage he had left behind and built something extraordinary. And that was the greatest victory of all. Fate had one last twist in store. One afternoon, as she exited a high-profile event, she spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. It took her a moment to recognize him. He looked so different now. Gone was the confident, well-groomed man who had once belittled her. In his place was someone gaunt, disheveled, and hollow-eyed. He saw her at the same moment, his face contorting in something between shame and longing. For a brief second, time seemed to freeze. He opened his mouth, as if searching for words, but none came. And she? She simply stared at him, unbothered, unmoved. Then, without a second glance, she turned away, stepping into her car and driving off without a single word. He had once been the center of her universe, but now, he was nothing. A man stripped of power, left with only his regrets. And that was punishment enough. As she sat in her office that night, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The journey had been painful, the betrayals deep, the struggles almost unbearable at times. But in the end, she had emerged stronger than ever. She had built a life far greater than the one she had lost, not because she sought revenge, but because she had refused to let his actions define her. She had once thought happiness meant security in someone else's arms. Now, she knew better. Happiness was self-sufficiency, the ability to stand on her own, the knowledge that she would never again depend on anyone who didn't deserve her trust. She had learned, grown, and triumphed. And for that, she was grateful. Her story became one of inspiration. People who had once whispered about her downfall now spoke of her resilience. Women going through their own heartbreaks reached out, seeking advice, finding solace in her journey. She didn't see herself as a hero, but she understood now, her survival, her success, had given others hope. And in that, she found a new purpose. She began mentoring young women in business, guiding them to build lives of independence and strength. She ensured that no one would ever feel as lost and powerless as she once had. Her pain had not been in vain. It had shaped her into someone unstoppable. And she would use that strength to uplift others. One evening, as she watched the city skyline from her penthouse, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, taking in the life she had created. It wasn't just about money or success, it was about peace. True, unshakable peace. She had fought battles she never expected to face, endured betrayals that would have broken a weaker person. But she had not only survived, she had flourished. The woman who had once been left with nothing was now a self-made powerhouse. She had won not by seeking revenge, but by refusing to let the past define her. And as she sipped her wine, a contented smile on her lips, she knew one thing with certainty: she would never, ever look back.